Jason, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you. I really appreciate your time in joining. And I think it was interesting because I'm here to talk to you all things arts education, the importance of creativity in the classroom. And right before we got on, I was scrolling through my Instagram and I came across Americans for the Arts just had a post that this is National Arts Education Week. And they have 5 things to know. And then, arts engagement in children often leads to improved peer, teacher, and adult relationships, better behavior. Research indicates that participating in arts activities at age 10 and 11 is linked to decrease in conduct problems, hyperactivity, and attention. I mean, I could go on and read all 5 of these points. One of my frustrations in arts advocacy is we can cite study after study after study, but why does it seem to not resonate with lawmakers or stakeholders? So I have said recently, if the story you're telling isn't getting you the results you need, time to retell your story. So if you could jump in and just, touch on a bit on, you say in your work that creativity will change the world. How do you reframe what that is so it does resonate with stakeholders? Or what are some tips that you could provide to others in our field to help guide them?
Yeah, sure. So I guess one of the things that I'll start with was, when I was a young teacher, I definitely would go more the route that you're talking about as far as advocacy, talking about the data that shows that it increases student engagement and all of those. But I started to realize quickly that it was more about the narrative and the narrative story of how is it impacting kids. And from there, then I started transitioning to like, what is it about the arts specifically? And also, if we're going to make the case to an administrator or the public outside of it, how can I best tell that story? And for me, it came down to the dispositions of what it means to be an artist and what it means to think like an artist. And I think that's a powerful story because when I talk to parents or anybody else in the community, what I talk about is the world that we live in right now. And the world that we live in right now has a surplus of problems and challenges. We are divided. So the dispositions of thinking like an artist, that's what I'll do when I talk to other parents and administrators and the community at large. And I think it helps to understand, what does it mean when we're talking about the arts? We know that it's part of sort of a well-rounded approach, but it goes much further than that. When we're talking about having a world where we need more imagination, because what we have is a series of complex, interconnected problems that are really going to take a creative mind to get us out of them. And so when you talk about that, then you go back to, okay, well, how do we get there? Well, we do creative exercises. We do activities that are involving those creative dispositions. And the art room is a great place for that to happen. A comfort with ambiguity, a playfulness, this idea of being empathically curious. All of those are going to have a huge impact on our kids and how they're going to be prepared to be successful in life. And so that's what I'll try to do, is just talk about dispositions and get away from necessarily how do they support the other disciplines, and more, how do they shine on their own? And I think one of the things that we see that they shine on their own is because they cultivate certain aspects of child development that aren't necessarily hit as strongly in other academic areas. And I've been a big advocate, these last couple of years of saying, thinking like an artist is probably one of the most essential ways we can be a thinker today, because they're doing the very things. Thinking like an artist involves the very aspects of what we're missing in our world right now. Connection. I mean, that's a huge thing. Artists slow down to notice the world. Artists slow down to notice the nuance of the world. And what happens is right now we're in sort of an era where we're very polarized to the binary. It's on one side or the other. There's no gray area. And what we know is that that's where the artists live. Artists live in that space between the polar ends. And I think that's another thing that helps is us advocate for it, is to say, like, we're going to help cultivate the dispositions of what it means to live in the messy middle. And how do we navigate that? How do we navigate the tensions of being both an individual and a collective member? And I could go on, and all these are areas that I think are cultivated in the arts. And I think that's where we need to start advocating for, is not necessarily the products, but the process of what it means to think like an artist, and how thinking like an artist actually is going to lead to success, not just in school and a career, but more importantly in life.
Yeah, you're talking like so many of these catchphrases that I've come up with resonate. I tell organizations, don't focus on the performance, focus on the process. The performance is important. It's this public celebration of all the work that you've done in the process, but transformation happens during the process. Because of that transformation, those artists can come together as a group and transform audiences, right? That's where you get that wow factor. I also say the arts need to come out of the closet. I feel like we talk in our own circle in the closet. We all know everything that you just went through, but we have a hard time going outside of our sector, crossing, into other industries to stand strongly that we definitely belong to have a seat at the table, right? And so how do we get there? How do we talk to individuals? Again, I say, when did the arts become a four-letter word?
Mm-hmm.
So when I was advocating during the pandemic, I would never go into a legislator's office and say, "Hi, I'm here to talk about the arts," because you get the unconscious eye roll of, "Oh my gosh, we're flaky. This is just a hobby. It's a craft." And I would get all the time, "I don't get the arts. I'm not into arts, but sure, it's important." And I would say, "Well, Representative, I have to believe that when you're drafting legislation or a floor speech, you've got to be creative in what you're writing to get fellow legislators to believe in your initiative." So what do you say to that when, I hear you, but what do you see as a sector on what we need to do more and more collectively to break down that barrier or break through the wall that we're confronting this conversation to banks and hospitals certainly know kind of the social aspect, but these manufacturing and all of these other industries that wouldn't even think of arts and creativity as an essential to their workforce.
Yeah, I almost say, without being too sort of simplistic about it, I almost say we work backwards, right? So we go into those environments and we talk about, where do you see creative problem solving in here? Do you think it's beneficial to slow down in any aspect of this employment in this industry? Is there a benefit to slowing down and noticing things? Is there a benefit to noticing patterns? And we start thinking about those dispositions as the backwards way, and then we can turn the question back of how are you developing that? How are you developing in your employees the ability to slow down and notice? How are you developing your employees the ability to break patterns, to see patterns? And I think once we start there, then we can start. Then the door is open, because I think one of the things I've learned a long time ago, especially being in the arts, and the arts and the schools are the same way. They're sort of like on the periphery. They're on the fringe. They're the first to get cut. They lack funding. And I found that the same thing you're finding. When we start talking about just saying the arts in general, you get people right away like, "I couldn't draw a stick figure. I couldn't do this. I couldn't do that." Failing to recognize that most likely they're using creativity every day, right? And so I found that when I'm doing discussions and things like that, I start backwards, and I start from, here are these sort of, how does imagination play out every day? It doesn't necessarily have to be uh, sort of the imagination that they might think of as a little child. It's the imagination of, like, if you have your problem, the way we're going to get out of that problem is going to be to imagine big solutions, big ideas, and start going from there. And again, then how do we get there? And so that for me helps frame that if you're doing something as little as, in my class, we're doing like a creativity challenge where the challenge is to, take an object and transform it into something else. And so they might see the product and say like, "Oh, look at that's a cute little sailboat that somebody made." Okay, but what you're missing is they started off with this cardboard too. And what they had to do is exercise flexible thinking and have the agility to adapt and think about what else could this be, and have iteration and have all those aspects that carry over into every industry. But they're missing that because they focus so much on the, "Oh, look at the cute little boat that was made out of this cardboard too." So for me, it's always starting backwards, talking to parents, talking to admin, whoever else will listen, of what are some of the skills and dispositions we need. And I think the arena is ripe today, especially in education, because what we're seeing from industry folks is that they're all saying they want creativity, but the schools aren't turning it out. And so when they say they want creativity, it's almost like it still is that enigma. If you push back, it's like, "Well, I just want creative thinking. I want," it's like when we say in schools, or in a life in general, here it is, be creative. I'm not sure, be creative. We use that sort of catchphrase of be creative, and that doesn't really explain it. Creativity needs constraints. And that's the other reason why I think it's been sort of misconfused or misinterpreted is, I hear creativity, I think it's a free for all. And, we can't have that in this industry. We don't need free for all. It's very much the opposite. Creativity needs constraints. And when the constraints happen, that's when the creativity is able to flourish. So talking about constraints, talking about all those aspects of it, this ambiguity, how are your employees comfortable with ambiguity? Because what we know is all jobs today are no longer going to be sort of, the days are long gone when you get a sheet that says, here's your responsibilities, and that's all that's going to be your responsibilities. That doesn't happen anymore. We all know that you get an infinite amount, and most likely everything you're going to do in your job is probably not on that job listing. So what that means is being comfortable with ambiguity. And that's, again, what the artists do. Artists approach life in this sort of state of openness, open to experience, open to new ideas, open to the complexity and the nuance of the world that I think most others without that artist mindset maybe are more closed off to it. And that's how we see as you get older, people say, I'm not an artist. It's not that you're not an artist. It's that you didn't think that the dispositions you're exhibiting are that of an artist.
Yeah. And I was guilty of that too. So I had a gallery at a time, my background's in politics and journalism and all that. Then here I open an art gallery, most vulnerable thing that I've ever done, because what do I know about art? That was my thought process. And I remember an artist was around me, and I said, oh, I'm not a creative. I just am passionate about supporting creatives. And they said, no, Angela, you are creative. You're creative in your own way. And that was that light bulb for me, even having a gallery that was like, oh, yes, we're all creative. Surgeons are creative. Engineers, scientists. I say this all the time. You can't be innovative if you're not creative. Edison, the Wright brothers were creatives. They were entrepreneurs. That's what artists are. So my world and focus has predominantly been elected officials. But what I'm hearing from you is, how much do we need to advocate to administrators on the importance? And I think a game changer in advocacy is getting those who benefit from the arts, from the creative workforce, to advocate for you. Mm-hmm. So when you have a Battelle or, a research company coming in telling lawmakers creativity is, top 3 of what we look for, that's really powerful. So do we need to focus on arts, education administrators? I mean, where are we in that world as far as understanding the importance of creativity in the classroom?
I think we've made some strides for sure. I know I can speak on behalf of my own district that we've made some great strides on seeing the benefits of creativity and recognizing its ability to help students connect problems and connect disparate ideas. And I think also what we're trying to work on is the same idea of helping demystify the word, the arts. And I think a lot of times language becomes the big hang up. And again, that's just to go back to the point of trying to use the words from the environment or the context that you're speaking in, which I know you clearly know all about, and making sure you adapt that language. And I think that's what, like, for me, when I'm thinking about going and advocating to parents, who my target audience is, it's tricky because on one side, they might want a plethora of products because that's what they're used to. That's what they had when they were kids growing up. It just was, a factory of churning out different creative products. But what I'm trying to do is just try to slow down and say, okay, let's look at the process. And so one of the ways I'll do that is try to make that more visible, whether it's through social media or documentation. And I think once you can start showing that, I think that's a big plus. So I think a lot of times in fields, when we advocate for the arts, we typically do show a final product and then we talk about the process. But what we really need to do is make the process visible. What is it like from the moment you pick up the violin to you're standing on the stage? Where is all the messy middle part? And I think that's what resonates with people. Like, oh wait, you're talking about like, that's what it looks like? Because that looked like in my kitchen the other day when I was making dinner for the family. Yes, that was being creative. Like, it's helping make that sort of mystical act of creating visible so that people can connect and say, oh, now I see. Now I see when I was, doing this sort of mundane task that maybe didn't think it was creative, all of a sudden now I see the creativity in how I solve the problem. Do you know what I mean?
100%, Jason. Like our communication, our thought process are so parallel. During the pandemic, I'm fighting for $50 million for ARPA funding for the arts. And, there were legislators that said the arts are for rich white old people. They don't need our help. And people gasp when I say that. And I tell this story all the time. And I pondered over and over, why is there still that connotation? Why? And then it hit me. And I thought, oh, I know why. Because for 40 years, how have we engaged lawmakers in the arts? We bring them to the orchestra gala. We bring them to the opening of the Nutcracker or Hamilton or the exhibition. They see magic. Mm-hmm. They see something that is aesthetically beautiful. When they're coming to the gala, they typically see older, affluent individuals that are likely political donors of theirs, right? We don't look like we're hurting. But when Honda wants a tax break, they don't take the governor to the Honda dealership and say, look at the 24 Civic. Isn't it beautiful? They take the governor to the assembly plant floor and they say it takes these many individuals to build one car. So I have implored with arts leaders to say, show the mess behind the art. It's about the process. Of course, you want to show off the end result. It's fantastic. But the critical thing is the process. The biggest struggle that I had was communicating or getting individuals to understand that when you say the arts, you're talking about people. I was told, Angela, why do the arts need help when there's food and housing insecurity? Well, when our sector was the highest unemployed sector, how many people in our industry were reliant on a food bank or didn't know how they were going to pay rent the next month? So respond to that a little bit from your lens. And how can we, as I want to begin a movement called the Renaissance of Relevance, it's going to take all of us together in unison to do this. So what are some ideas that you have or that you employ now that others listening could think about in their own communities?
Well, one thing we've done is we've had these creative, we called them creative connected communities. And the idea was to have parents come in and engage in some creative acts and have connections with other people around them and talk about this idea of creativity and imagination. And because at the end of the day, it's like, I think it goes back to a book called Collective Illusions by, I believe it's Todd Rose. And he talks about this idea of, a lot of people think that other people want something, so they don't share their true feelings, but really the whole group wants the same thing, just nobody's voiced it. And I think that's true with creativity, is a lot of people right now are yearning for creative acts because they see kids and everybody else sort of scrolling on phones mindlessly and getting distracted. And I think they all want this aspect of, I want my kids to be engaged and making and creating. And so one of the things we did was we held these C3 nights. So one of them was, an online baking of cookies, and you could bring your own ingredients to it and share. And we had these sort of informal ways to gather, and the common thread was a creative act, whether it was with Legos, whether it was with baking, whether it was with fort making. We just tried to get more people engaged in it, because a lot of times too, it's trying to break down that idea of like, well, I could never do that, or I'm not an artist. We have to not only, again, to build on that point, the last point of make it visible, we also have to engage them to do the process. And I think once they do the process, they can start to see that, one, it's not, it's difficult, but it's also not as difficult as they would think. It's the idea of, we see it like when you, like you said, when they see most products, they are highly polished, highly professional products. But when you go through the creative act, you realize that that's a long way to get there. That's like the equivalent of, the best in the industry, kind of showcasing their skills, whereas you don't see sort of the entrepreneur or the startup company and how they get there. So that's one thing that we've done, is having parents come in and engage in creative activities, and also just showcasing, when I showcase the process for parents and administrators, I make it visible. So we have an area outside the classroom that is an area where it's mid-process. So kids will exhibit their work starting from day one. So they might other kids might walk by or parents might walk by and there's just a random cardboard box. And then that evolves over the course of the time that they're there. So just having visual reminders too, that this is a process. It's something, it's kind of like pulling back the curtain of that creative process and recognizing that. But I truly believe, part of it is now our advocacy, like efforts, I just truly believe are this idea of where are we in the world and how do we help, how are we hoping to get out of there? And really what it's going to take is to truly think like an artist and to then make it clear what that means. And going back to those dispositions to demystify it. But I firmly believe that if we don't educate others on the fact that the very things that we bemoan in our society and our culture would be non-existent if we approached it from thinking like an artist. Artists are the ones who live on the fringe of society. They constantly propel us and push us forward. They're the ones who are the risk takers. They're the ones who are going left when everybody else goes right. They're taking the road less traveled by. And to embrace that mindset, that's where we all have to be, because we're in a situation where with artificial intelligence and everything else, we need to start sort of doubling down on how do we approach a constantly changing world, a world that's changing at breakneck speed. And what we know is that the arts do that. The arts are flexible and agile. That's what they do. They're performance and performance based in a sense where they're constantly making iterations. They're getting real time feedback from audiences. They're getting real time feedback from patrons. They're making iterations and adjusting their craft in real time. And I think that's what we have to start recognizing, is that our world requires that. And thinking like an artist is not a sort of a fluffy extra thing. It is an essential aspect of how we approach life, because at the end of the day, those mindsets are going to be what helps us solve problems and, more importantly, identify potential new problems down the road that we can already make inroads on because we've got that creative mindset ready to tackle it.
Yeah, one of my pet peeves is when I hear people advocate, say, well, you should support because the arts uplift. And I now say, out of frustration, no, a bra uplifts, or at least it should. The arts are foundational, right? But you say that an educator needs to be the classroom creative whisperer. Can you give me some examples of what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think it's just sort of going around, touching base, and this can be true in any aspect with an artist. I think one of the beautiful aspects of an artist is they connect disparate ideas. And I think that's one of the values that the arts brings. And I think that so for me in my practice on a school level is, if a child is stuck or hits that creative roadblock, I know that child and I get to know that child to have a connection with them. So I'm able to kind of throw out some seeds and see how they connect it. And inevitably what happens is there's an aha moment. And it's that roadblock. It's this idea of collective creativity. And so when you do that, then all of a sudden they go off and they have a whole other sort of waterfall of ideas that come out. And I think that's true in general in life too. It takes that artist mindset where if you're having two, industry leaders that are kind of at an impasse or can't figure it out, it's the artist who goes in and whispers an idea. It's the artist who goes in and says, have you thought about it this way? Have you looked at it this way? Have you tried that? And that's, again, another value of what the arts brings, is they bring this ability to connect seemingly disparate ideas in ways that nobody else thought of. And so in the classroom, that's what I'll try to do, is I'll try to go, and from working with teachers as well, trying to take what they have, because they're inevitably 9 times out of 10, they're on the cusp of having this sort of creative idea explode and bloom and blossom, but they just are hitting an impasse. And so I think if we don't have those creativity whisperers, what they do is they atrophy because they say, well, I couldn't do it. And they don't see that they were so close. So it takes that sort of artist that goes up as a catalyst to just say, here's one little thought, here's one little tweak, here's one little idea that maybe would help you think differently of it. And poof, the doors open and new ideas flow. And I think that's what I mean by the creativity whisperer, is trying to plant a seed that somebody else can nurture with their skills and talents and passions. And all you did was just sit there and you connected an idea that maybe they didn't see, in the hopes of then them down the road being able to connect their own ideas and pass it on as well.
Yeah, so I hear you talk about bringing parents in and having them understand the process and how it applies in all aspects of life. Going back again, how much do we need to look at school boards and administrators and those to understand the importance that we fund these? And when we say that arts are the first to get cut, is that at a local level? Is that at a district level? Is it a trickle down or ripple effect from state level? Where are we as far as that? I don't want to use the word battle because I want to be positive, but the work that we have to ensure that we adequately fund arts education.
So, so I mean, just to cut it plain and simple, I mean, the arts are not in the state of Ohio a tested subject. So because of that, funding goes towards where the tested subjects are, and they're called the core disciplines, which I already, as you can imagine, I already have a problem with. That you have core discipline, meaning that others are left out, others are marginalized. So from one aspect of it, it comes down to these sort of, unfortunately, the standardized test movement that delineates who has more priority. And also, the other aspect of it is that works against the arts at times is that it is subjective. And schools have a quantification bias. They love to be able to quantify everything because it's easy. And one of the things I was just telling somebody else this recently, one of the things about the arts is the arts are best measured in the long game. They're not measured in the short game. The arts are you down the road have an epiphany that you learned from experience in the arts, from being engaged in the arts. It's how you look at the world. It's how you view the world. So in the schools, it's a challenge because, most of schooling is geared towards the short term because it's about grade level progression. Now, I think one of the ways that we're starting to push back on that is this idea of seeing that creativity is essential and having industry leaders say that and recognizing that. I think where there still is a little bit of a disconnect is there are still some administrators or districts that maybe don't understand the connection between, ironically enough, creativity and the arts. I think right away they like to go to their comfort zone and say, well, how do we get more creativity in science? Oh, let's call it STEAM. Okay, there it is. Let's call it STEAM. And so I think they look to put it in there and kind of ignore the experts that are in the room already, that have the training that can say, look, if we want creative thinkers in our school, let's start supporting it more vocally. So I think that we're on the right path because we recognize that creativity is essential. I think we still have work to do, is to recognize the ability of the arts to actually get to the creative thinking that districts are after. And then on top of that, how do we make it visible? So one of the things that I'm trying to work on right now is I have a group of teachers from all across the Central Ohio area that are doing sort of creative, innovative practices with their classrooms. And I said, you know what, instead of having these all happen in pockets in the shadows, let's bring them all out into the spotlight. So we have what we call the Agents of Change Festival. And we had it at the museum right before the pandemic. And we had about 200 parents there from 6 different districts, individual classes from those districts. And then last year we had it in Hilliard and we had over 500 parents there. And so what that does is that tells the story of these kids are extremely excited, extremely engaged. They're able to use those creative capacities. There's an element of art in all of these. And so that helps change the narrative. So I think ultimately what comes down to is it's the parents too. It's the parents that they can go to say, I want more of the arts programs. I want more consistency with it. We still have math every day, but art is once a week. And I think there's a disservice in that because at the end of the day, you have every child is a creative thinker. Some are, it's that idea of some are weed or some are dandelions and some are orchids. The dandelions will grow anywhere. That was me. That was probably you too. I was the creative thinker. No matter what you did, I was going to think creatively. But for a lot of us, we're orchids and our creativity is very fragile. And if it's not nurtured, it sort of goes away and it sort of atrophies. And I think we have to recognize is that we can't have an education system that says for one day a week, for 45 minutes, we're going to really focus down on those creative abilities and the arts. And then the rest of the day, we're just going to let it go. And I think that's where we have to do better on. And I think we'll get there. I think that one way or another, because when we talk about project-based learning and some of these things that are more sort of question-based, well, then the arts have a seat at the table. And I think if we can start to transition away from isolated disciplines and start focusing more on issues and questions that drive our kids' curiosity, then all of a sudden we see the value of the arts again because we're like, oh my gosh, here's a whole other mindset that we didn't tap into that could really address this problem or issue.
The STEM is transactional. It's one-dimensional. Yes, it's important. But we need to go beyond putting an A in the word and calling it STEAM. We really need to understand that it's exactly what you've been saying this whole 30 minutes. Artists employ strategies that engage minds every day. And we hope that our physics teacher or our trig teacher are creative in the way that they can educate those subjects. So again, it's so logical to me that I don't understand why we don't see more industries widely seeing this and accepting this.
Yeah, I definitely feel you on that. I mean, I think that aspect of thinking about, the way they renamed it and the ability to see if you, stick a kid in front of a computer and they code, that's all they know. I think that's so true. And that just epitomizes where we are today, and kids a lot of kids aren't engaged in school right now because they figured out the game of school and they don't want any part of it. And I think it's because they recognize the world doesn't live in isolation. The world does not operate in isolated blocks of time where you have to turn off science, turn off, your mathematical thinking. I think what they realize is they want to be problem finders, problem solvers. And again, that's where the arts come in, because the arts represent that ability to connect these disparate ideas. If you don't have that artist mindset, it's a lot harder to do that. And also what it comes down to is you start doing those things if you have a project-based learning or issue-based, you start to use those mindsets in a way that really make it visible and clear how valuable the arts are. And I think that's, like, for me, when the pandemic hit, one of the things I noticed was, we going online virtually overnight and trying to figure out how are you going to, teach art digitally. Well, I wasn't as stressed about it because it was sort of going to my mindset right away, where I was like, okay, when they leave, they're going to go off. What do I want for them to come back? Well, I want them to be curious. Okay, then I need to design an experience where I'm fostering curiosity out in the world. I want them to be empathetic. I want them to take risks. I want them to be flexible in their thinking. So I designed experiences where they had to do those things when they came back. And I feel like that showed to me, like, that's how our schools should be run. Our schools should be run in a way where they are interest-based, they are curiosity-driven, they are flexible, they are adaptable, and most importantly, they recognize the fact that the arts are essential to all this. And I think for me, that's what kind of keeps me going, is to know that we're not there yet, but I think we can get there. And I think we can get there for the sheer fact that everything in our world is pointing to those signs that we need creative thinkers, we need the arts. It's just, to your point, we don't know yet. Other people don't know yet how to get there. And I think the artists are the ones who have the answers. And so I think we're going to start to see, like, oh, that artist over there in the shadows, let's bring them out to light, because I think they have some answers that maybe we've been missing for the last 40 or 50 years.
I'm working with a group of a cohort of nonprofit arts where we're actually going to be building a logic model for quantitative, qualitative assessment of arts outcome, where we're going to look at empathy and kindness and strategic thinking. So I met a woman who's got organizational psychology background. She does this for the social sector nonprofits. We're now building a model that specifically applies to the arts, because I too agree with you. We're like equal in that we've got to have data to go with these stories for, I think, it really to make this transition and shift, because you're right. A lot of people know this, but when we talk about short-term, long-term outcomes or return on investment, what I'm saying is I want to build a model that shows your return on art, what's your ROA. And if we can start talking in a business setting, my hope is that it runs down to the educators. You're at the front line. And how do we empower you and enable you to build capacity and sustainability so we can, as you say, change the world with creativity?
Yeah, I love that. It, made me think when you were talking about that is the other aspect. I think when you were talking about kids with social media, I think the other benefit of the arts, which is huge, is the independence aspect of it. I think that we live in a society today where we don't let kids have a lot of independence. We're very much scheduled from thing to thing. And I think the arts are inherently independent because it's you making choices, right? Making choices based on either the problem you have, what you're trying to express, but it's you independent. Like, you're in charge of it. like in our classroom, in our art studio, we have saws and drills, and people are always shocked at that. And it's like, no, I mean, if you teach a kid how to use those safely, they can use it, and it provides another tool for them.
Oh, yeah, 100%. So I'm going to round out this conversation. Yep. Clearly, we could go on forever, and I hope to have you back again. So I usually end these conversations asking everybody the same 2 questions. So Arts Redefined, name of the podcast. Clearly, you've said many times we agree that we need to redefine what we mean by the arts, thus my reason for naming the podcast that. So how do you define art?
I guess I would say I would define art as connecting disparate ideas, breaking patterns, and rearranging life in a way that hasn't been seen before.
That's a lot to think about. So thank you. I like that. Okay, last one. What color do you most love and why?
That is a good question. I would say it is a sort of deep blue, and it reminds me of the Irish Ocean. I was fortunate enough to be able to go to Ireland every summer for about 20 years. And there's just something about the ocean that changes to about 500 different shades of blue and green. But for a lot of time, because there's an overcast in Ireland, it's this sort of deep, dark, sort of foreboding blue that it's just piercing. And I really love it. So I would say that it's a sort of Irish blue that you can only witness if you go there and see it on a cloudy day.
That's really cool because it immediately ties in color to place and experience all of that. So you've encapsulated all of that in one. So that's awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. Jason, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thanks for coming on the podcast. And we will have a link to your website and any other information so people can find you if they would like to reach out.
It's my pleasure. I enjoyed doing it, and I love seeing all the content you put out because it's so valuable and it's such a great resource. So thank you for having me on.
Thanks, Jason.